Hello and welcome to the special program. My name is Vineet Malhotra. You're watching another interesting episode of A Long Story Short. And today with me on the show, we have somebody who really doesn't need an introduction. He's somebody who's known to speak his heart. He's somebody who's considered a straight shooter in a profession, which is topsy-turvy in nature. We are joined by Mr. Anil Swarup, former Coal Secretary, former IS. Sir, appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. I've been trying to speak to you for a very long time, but you are a busy man, and I'm fortunate that I got to speak to you as much as I will today. We'll straight away, jump into the deep end of this conversation. Well, I follow you on LinkedIn as well, and you had put out a post about the recent exoneration that has come about by the High Court, I believe, when it comes to the coal scam. Now, that has been a very dark chapter in the history of our country for more reasons than one. Politically, even image-wise, and of course, all the complications that it brought about and all the people that were involved as well. In retrospect, and considering what's transpired in the last 24 hours, how do you look back upon the Colgate scam?
Now, first of all, let me clarify that the judgment that came a couple of days ago was by the CBI court. They exonerated Mr. Harish Gupta and a few others who were implicated in something in coal scam. You know, my understanding of coal scam was a bit different from the usual understanding of coal scam. And I had the occasion to go through some of the files as Coal Secretary, Government of India. And my view has been outlined in my book, Not Just a Civil Servant, where I clearly say that though there were a number of wrongs done in the allocation of coal blocks, it was absolutely wrong to say that everything was wrong with the allocation. So the impression that gained around was that everything that went about was wrong, was incorrect, because unfortunately the calculations made by the then CAG were not very sound. I have tried to explain that in my book. Briefly speaking, my view was that you can't calculate the notional loss on the basis of average cost of mining, because anyone who understands coal will understand that the cost of mining of each block depends on the depth at which coal becomes available. And it would be wrong to say that there could be an average depth of mining coal. Apart from that, there were many other wrongs that were done. But the biggest wrong perhaps was done to Mr. Harish Gupta. I have known him as an officer. I have known him as a person. Absolutely honest. If I have to pick on somebody in my cadre to be an honest officer, Mr. Harish Gupta. And there you are, Mr. Harish Gupta. I recall one single. Then what had happened was that recommendations had come from the state government, and the proposal was put before a committee which was headed by Mr. Harish Gupta. Now, the person who had moved the application had put in wrong documents, which were not visible on the face of the record. Obviously, the committee went by recommendation and recommended, and the then coal minister approved it. Later on, it was discovered that the documents that were furnished by the applicant were fraudulent. Now, how in the hell can you hold Secretary Government of India liable for a document as a part of a huge file which were considered to be wrong? I'm just giving one example. There are many such examples. And if, for argument's sake, and this is what I've argued in the book, for the sake of argument, you hold Mr. Harish Gupta responsible for it, why should the other committee members be held also responsible? And finally, this committee only recommended. The final approval was by the then coal minister. Why should he also be held accountable? My basic premise is that none of them was responsible for this allocation. But for the sake of argument, it became Mr. Harish Gupta. So there were many such cases. In another case, the CBI pleads before the CBI court that the case is not made out. Yet the CBI court says, no, you further investigate. And ironically, even before actual further investigation, a permission is sought to prosecute the officers. There were all sorts of things going on. And unfortunately, when you create that vitiated environment, then your judgment goes for a toss. And in my understanding, as I keep repeating, there were indeed wrongs done in coal block allocation. But what should have been done was to examine at length each case, fix responsibility, rather than painting everyone with the same brush and calling everyone dishonest, starting cases against everyone. In fact, today morning I tweeted, and I stand by that tweet, that if you club honest and dishonest for hounding, the dishonest will get away, and the honest will feel harassed. It's
Mm.
very unfortunate what has happened in the coal sector.
Right. So there was also, a statement made by you very eloquently. You had answered about how, the paucity of something creates a scam in a particular country. In context to coal, what really happened?
See, as I've said in the past, mafias thrive on shortages, either man-made shortages or natural shortages. In this particular case, India sits on 300 billion tons of coal. And at that point in time, when I took over as coal secretary, our requirement was about 800 to 900 million tons. But we were excavating much lesser than that. About in all, for private and public sector, it would be around 600 million tons, 550 to 600, which was about 24.5% short. So that's a huge shortage. And this was met through imports. And as a consequence of the shortage, so whenever you have shortages, you have this rent seeking and mafias come into being. And that's what that happened then. So when I took over, I tried to understand the cause of the scam. Everyone was worried about the scam. It was then that I discovered that this scam, so-called scam, happened because of shortages. So in my first book, Not Just a Civil Servant, I have written a chapter where I mentioned the real coal story. The real coal story was not as much of coal block auctions as I was credited with, but the increase in coal production. Look what happens in 2014-15 and 15-16. When I took over in 2014, there were more than 25 power plants that were critical in nature, meaning thereby they had coal only for about a day or two. They were really running short. So that was the situation then. So in 2014-15, as a consequence of these steps that were taken, the coal production increased by 34 million tons, which was more than the cumulative increase of coal in the previous 4 years. So that is what that happened. I mean, I have a whole story to say how that happened, but that is what that happened. And then in 15-16, on that increased amount, another 44 million tons came into being. As a consequence of which, during 2016, we didn't have a single plant that was had shortage of coal. In fact, it became a different market altogether. Now, Coal India was running after their buyers. Please pick up the coal because coal catches fire if it is not consumed quickly. So then it was the other way around. Instead of the people in demand running after Coal India, now Coal India was going after them. And we were even toying with the idea of exporting coal to Bangladesh. So the whole scenario had undergone a change from acute shortage to a time when we were planning to export coal to Bangladesh. We didn't actually, but that was the situation where we had decent amount of coal. Let me explain here. There is certain amount of coal, the quality of which is such that it has to be imported. So that's not an issue. I always felt that what has to be imported will be imported. But what could be produced locally should be produced locally so that that type of coal is not imported to the country.
Mm. Right. So, something comes to my mind when we talk about the Colgate scam. Do you think that a lot of these scams that happened were also, the fault of the government of that day, and perhaps something like this would not have happened in today's time, considering the kind of government we have today? How are you, in fact, looking at that?
Yes, actually, government cannot shy away from the responsibility, whether this one or the previous one. If a wrong has happened, the government has to be held responsible. No one can say that the government was not responsible. I think there should have been and there would have been transparent processes which were subsequently put in 2015 for determining the manner in which coal blocks get allocated. I mean, one is auctioning them. The other is, even if the allocation has to be made, the process has to be transparent. Obviously, there was a process, but by transparency, I mean, which we tried to do in 2015, was tell everybody what is happening. Much of the problem or problems that we face today is on account of opacity of what is happening. Imagine a scenario where the world knows what's going on. It will be very difficult to indulge in corrupt practices. My consistent take on corruption has been that instead of only focusing on hounding individuals for corrupt practices, you make processes transparent. Once the processes are transparent, it would be very difficult. Let me give you an example. When I was doing this coal block auctions, even I committed mistakes. Committing mistake is a very natural phenomenon. When you do something, it is very difficult to say you won't commit any mistakes. But if you have a transparent process, the mistake will get caught immediately. So malafide will not be attributed to you. Now, even if you are bona fide in your approach and the mistake gets discovered 5 years down the line, it becomes very difficult for you to justify what happened, why happened. Here, in a particular case, I remember we didn't calculate correctly. And as a consequence of the environment at that point in time, joint secretaries also were very reluctant to commit themselves on the file because they don't know whether even if they are doing the right thing, they could be caught, as was the case in so-called coal scam. I mean, some of the officers, I know they were absolutely outstanding, but they got caught in the crossfire. So no joint secretary was committing it. I mean, I think it would be probably for the first time in the history of this country that some of the files or recommendations were initiated by Secretary Government of India. So in doing that and constraint of time, I think in a couple of cases, the calculation was wrong. And we ended up allocating it to the wrong person in the auction. But we discovered it almost immediately because it was put on the portal. People pointed out there's something wrong. We looked at the file, we corrected it, held a press conference, admitted our mistake and corrected it. So committing mistakes is natural. Now, my take on doing away with corruption is define processes, make them totally transparent. It will be virtually impossible for people to adopt corrupt practices. But the tragedy is that all of us want others to become transparent. They themselves do not want to be transparent. One of the biggest part of corruption is the delays, which we call the speed money. You sit on the file and you're not taking decision. The decision is right, the process, everything is right, but you're not conveying a decision or you're not taking a decision. All this can be taken care of. Let me go a few years before I became Coal Secretary, and this happened in the UPA government. I was made chairman of the project monitoring group because it was felt that the officers had stopped giving clearance as a consequence of all these so-called scams. They felt that we will not commit. So I was heading that project monitoring group wherein we were considering each project which was of 1,000 crore or more. And we were asked to fast-track decisions. Imagine we fast-track decisions in projects worth 5 lakh crores during UPA 2 and not a finger was raised. Now imagine what was happening in Coal, 2G, Commonwealth Games Camp, and here we are fast-tracking project, each of which is 1,000 crore, and no one is pointing a finger. And we were clearing them. Private and public projects, no one questioned. Why? Because in that project monitoring group, we didn't have any file. Every decision was recorded on the portal straight away at the time of meeting. When I used to hold these tripartite meetings, the minutes of the meeting were dictated on the portal. Can you believe it? No one does that. So first, it expedited everything. Second, what I used to tell joint secretaries to the other ministry, if you have to reject a proposal, please reject it. But don't sit on a file beyond a particular period of time. Correct. So that people ask me, how did you manage to get so much cleared? I said, simple. I used to ask the ministries to take a decision, whatever that decision is. Because if you reject a particular proposal, you have to give a reason. If you accept it, it's fine. So I did not take any decision. I was only asking them. And how did this decision happen? Because if you make the transparent process, people will get to know who's sitting on which file for how many hours, how many minutes. No matter how inefficient I may be, to the public, I'd like to appear to be efficient. And that's the trick. I continue to say even now that all the processes in the government, except those relating to national security, should be put in public domain and made transparent. You can't imagine the good that it will do to decision making.
You're absolutely right, sir. And there is also this very famous episode when you had a conversation with the Prime Minister regarding what was going on in the scenario pertaining to coal. Tell us about that, sir.
No, I used to have a few conversations with the Prime Minister. My first conversation was a very different one.
There was a time you corrected him over something, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I not corrected him. I used to have different opinion. I used to mention my opinion to him, and it was really kind of him. बड़प्पन था उनका कि वो उसको अन्यथा नहीं लेते. He didn't take it otherwise. And it started in the first meeting itself. I remember in the first meeting, the power secretary had made a presentation. He presented 6-7 slides. In all those slides, he stated that the problems of the power sector are on account of coal. So at the end of the presentation, the Prime Minister turns towards me, and this is my first conversation with him. He tells me, Anil ji, आपने देखा, आप कोल की स्थिति सुधार दीजिए, देश की आर्थिक स्थिति सुधर जाएगी. These are his words. So I told him, sir, I agree with you. मैं आपसे सहमत हूं, लेकिन शायद ये कहना उचित नहीं होगा कि ऊर्जा क्षेत्र की समस्त समस्याएं कोयले की वजह से हैं.
हम्म।
ऊर्जा क्षेत्र को हमें कॉम्प्रिहेंसिवली देखना पड़ेगा। अब देखिए, लुक एट हिज रिस्पॉन्स,
हम्म।
ही अग्रीज विद मी despite my disagreement with him. He agrees with me and turns towards Mr. Piyush Goyal and tells him, अनिल जी सही कह रहे हैं, आपको ऊर्जा क्षेत्र को कॉम्प्रिहेंसिवली देखना पड़ेगा। उन्होंने शब्द को इस्तेमाल किया उस दिन। इट हेल्ड मी इनॉर्मसली because people got this impression, though I was meeting Mr. Modi for the first time, that I was close to Mr. Modi, which I wasn't. So मेरा काम फिर आसानी से चला कोयले में। उसके बाद एक आध बार उन्होंने मेरी तारीफ भी की सेक्रेटरीज की कमेटी में कि इन्होंने बड़ा अच्छा काम किया। And look at my last meeting with him. I had very interesting conversations with him. My last meeting was not in the context of coal or education, which I was holding as a charge. I got a call from Principal Secretary Prime Minister, and during the call, the Principal Secretary said that we are trying to convince the Prime Minister about health insurance, but he seems to be very reluctant about it because he has a different view of insurance. He doesn't feel that they will do the good job. So can you come and explain health insurance to him? So I told him, sir, what is my locus and I'm Education Secretary. He said, no, you have you have understood insurance. You give it a try if you are able to convince the Prime Minister. Okay. So in the evening, I went there. So Health Secretary made a presentation. And Prime Minister also was partly upset. He said, why are you pushing health insurance? I mean, he was not very comfortable with insurance companies. Then he asked me, अनिल जी आप रहे हैं इंश्योरेंस में, आपकी क्या राय है? मेरी राय वही थी जो हेल्थ सेक्रेटरी की थी. I spoke for 15 minutes and without interrupting me, the Prime Minister listened to me. At the end of it, he says, आप सही कह रहे हैं. That day, Ayushman Bharat was born. Now, here, I was presenting something which Prime Minister did not like. And here is a man who agrees with me. And Ayushman Bharat is born. So what I am trying to say here is, there were occasions where I had a different opinion with him. I put it across to him. And I don't recall in a single case, he either rebuffed me or, he discussed. And we came to conclusions.
Mm. So you're often also viewed as someone who isn't scared of politicians. Do you enjoy that tag or that reputation?
So I being scared or not scared, I don't know what does that mean. I
Somebody
fortunately
who's
could not.
somebody who's able to speak his mind.
No, I spoke my mind irrespective. There are simple reasons why I did that. First of all, I did not expect anything from the politician. So that gave me a lot of strength. If you expect something, then it makes you weak. So I didn't expect anything. In the same meeting, which I was mentioning to you about health insurance, as I was coming out of the room, a joint secretary in the PMO said, "Sir, आपको तो पता था नाराज हो जाते हैं इंश्योरेंस के नाम पे, आपने फिर भी अपनी बात कह दी." You know what I answered? I said, मुझे ना इनसे अभी कुछ चाहिए ना रिटायरमेंट के बाद कुछ चाहिए. जो मैंने ठीक समझा वो मैंने बता दिया, बाकी इनकी मंशा है जो चाहे. I always felt that it is the duty of a civil servant to politely convey his point of view. And I'll narrate an incident. It's a very early habit. When I was Special Secretary to Mr. Kalyan Singh when he was Chief Minister, I was Director of Information and Public Relations. A very interesting incident I've narrated in my book. It was in the morning I had gone to brief him about the newspaper publication. I'm talking of 91. So my job was to go every morning and take those paper clippings and show him and seek his guidance on them. On this particular day, when I reached his residence, the Chief Secretary and DGP were standing there. And the Chief Minister was a bit upset. So I stood beside the Chief Secretary listening to the conversation. The conversation was around public meetings or political meetings for a by-election in Ottawa. Now, the Chief Minister was not well and 7 meetings had been lined up. So he was a bit upset. कि किसने लगा दी 7 मीटिंग, मैं नहीं जा पाऊंगा, आखिरी 2 मीटिंग कैंसिल कर दो, मेरी तबीयत ठीक नहीं है. So as he said that, both the Chief Secretary and DGP vehemently agreed with him. Yes, sir, आपकी तबीयत ठीक नहीं, हम नहीं जा सकते. अब मेरी आदत खराब थी, मैंने बीच में मैं टपक पड़ा. मैंने उनसे कहा कि साहब वैसे तो आपका राजनीतिक प्रकरण है, बट मैं कुछ दिन पहले डिस्ट्रिक्ट मैजिस्ट्रेट था. तो जब चीफ मिनिस्टर आता है सर, बड़ी तैयारियां होती हैं, लोगों को आशाएं होती हैं, अपेक्षाएं होती हैं. आप चाहे 2 मिनट के लिए जाइए जरूर, कैंसिल मत कीजिए. तो उन्होंने मेरी तरफ घूर के देखा, क्या मैं जा सकता हूं? जैसे ही उन्होंने कहा क्या मैं जा सकता हूं, चीफ सेक्रेटरी मुझे कोनी मारने लगे चुप रहने के लिए. मैं चुप नहीं हुआ. मैंने फिर कहा, मैंने कहा साहब निर्णय तो आपको लेना, मैंने जो अपनी राय थी दे दी. उसके बाद 10 सेकंड कोई नहीं बोला, पिन ड्रॉप साइलेंस. 10 सेकंड बाद कल्याण सिंह जी फिर मेरी तरफ घूमे, बोले अनिल जी आप सही कह रहे हैं, मुझे जाना चाहिए. जैसे ही उन्होंने कहा, चीफ सेक्रेटरी अपने कोनी पीछे खींची और बोले हाँ सर बिल्कुल सही कह रहा है. नाउ ये चीज मैं भूल गया था. कल्याण सिंह जी को जब वो दोबारा चीफ मिनिस्टर बने, जब उन्होंने बुलाया मुझे अपने पास और कहा मैं तुम्हें अपना सचिव बनाना चाहता हूं, तो मैंने कहा ठीक है सर. तो बोले पूछोगे नहीं क्यों बनाना चाहते हो? मैंने साहब आपने सोच समझ के निर्णय लिया होगा. बोले नहीं बैठो तुम्हें बताता हूं. मैं बैठ गया तो कहते हैं तुम्हें याद है कोनी, याद है तुम्हें कोनी? उनको याद था. So what I am trying to say here is, right from the beginning of my career, I had this habit of speaking my mind out. I couldn't care less because I had no other intention behind it. I always felt that if you have a point of view which you feel strongly about, you should speak it out. And if you get overruled, there are many cases in which I was overruled, then go by the decision because these are just opinions. And my approach was very simple. If my boss tells me to do anything illegal, there's no question of doing it. If the issue is not, if legality is not involved, it's only views, my view and his view. My first job will be to try and convince him about my views. But if he overrules me, so be it. I didn't carry it personally. I carry out his job. So that left me very easy. But this happened only after 10, 12 years of my career. Initially, I used to fight with every politician.
So there's also another popular anecdote about a DM and a CM and a briefcase, and you were privy to what was happening. Can you narrate that also for us,
No,
please?
that was a very interesting thing. I was special secretary to Miss Mayawati, and once a week we were day officers. On this particular, I was a day officer, so I was sitting at her residence, sitting outside. There was a district magistrate a year junior to me. He came to meet the chief minister, and he had a briefcase in his hand. We knew each other, so he said, "Hello, hi." So carrying a briefcase is no problem. So he went inside. When he came out, he did not have the briefcase in his hand. So then I asked him, "वो तुम्हारा briefcase शायद छूट गया उसको?" बोले, "नहीं नहीं, उसमें कुछ फाइलें थी, वो मैं मुख्यमंत्री को देने आया था." तो आई टोल्ड हिम, यार चीफ मिनिस्टर को तो फाइलें डीएम को आता नहीं देने, ये तुम क्या लाए थे? Then I could discern that there was something wrong. Frankly speaking, I have said I don't know what was there in the briefcase. This is my conjecture. And going by the expression of the district magistrate, I felt there was something wrong here. So that was the instance.
Hmm. So you've often also said that it's difficult being an IAS. The civil services are perceived to be extremely promising. There is a lot of hope, there's a lot of power, you get to serve the country. But at the same time, you have also mentioned that it is a slippery slope and it is in dire need of reforms as well. Would you elucidate on that, sir?
The civil service is not very easy, thoroughly enjoyable. That could be the reason. I've used this couplet in my book, मुख्तसर सी जिंदगी क्या जब से अफसाने हैं, यहाँ तीर भी चलाने हैं, परिंदे भी बचाने. So it's a quintessential
Good
dilemma.
one. Yes.
During my career, I felt that the whole system has to change, right from recruitment to training to human resource management to mentoring. And I've written that in my book. For example, UPSC is an amazing body, very good body, absolutely above board, selects good people, but it does not select leaders. The skills that are required of an IAS officer is that of a leader. Some accidentally or some consciously become leaders, but I don't think UPSC can be credited with selecting leaders. They select people who can write and speak well. These are the attributes of a leader, but leader requires many more attributes. For example, I say attitude. I think that's the single most attribute that needs to be examined, whether the person is positive in his dispensation, whether he's accessible. So these are attributes that are not assessed by UPSC. Say about 20 years ago, I don't think they could have been assessed. Now they can be assessed. So in my view, the examination for the IAS has to be different from other examinations because an audit and accounts officer does not require the attributes required of an IAS officer because you have to work as a team leader. You have to take work. I've often said about this debate of generalists versus specialists that why are we making IAS officers specialists? Because you can outsource expertise, you can't outsource attitude. So the focus has to be attitude in terms of recruitment. Then while training, my view is, why are you teaching them CRPC, CPC in the academy? I think you should expose them to officers who had a positive attitude, who were accessible, who were successful, who had integrity. Usual impression is that all honest officers are suffering, which is absolutely incorrect. All honest officers who are efficient are not suffering. Honest officers, by and large, suffer because they're inefficient, some of them. So efficiency has to go along with it. Honesty. Honesty is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. So you have to become efficient. In order to become efficient, the training has to be to make him efficient, to get him a positive attitude. That is how the training should be done. Then after the training, since the terrain in which the IAS officer works is a difficult one. I said Muktasar si Zindagi. It's a difficult one. And in that difficult terrain, there should be a system of mentorship. In private sector, you have a system of mentorship. Mentorship does not mean that you are breathing down the throat of that officer. No. All senior officers with positive dispensation are available for a conversation. that itself is a great psychological support. I have written about it. I'm working towards it, of formalizing a mentorship of IS officers. So I think IS has to be treated differently, and it has to be evolved differently. You can't trivialize this service, because they hold such responsible positions that even a single IS officer doing wrong things can do enormous amount of damage. So every individual has to be selected carefully. He has to be trained meticulously, and then he has to be nurtured thereafter. So this needs to be done.
Hmm. Uh, So we almost run out of time. We also need to talk about your involvement with education today. You are involved with Arise as well. It's an organization which is trying to do a lot when it comes to, in fact, consolidating all resources and work towards the agenda of education. You also mentioned UPSC right now. And of course, there are a number of areas which are covered by education. How do you look at this particular space, and what kind of reforms do you propose India needs to, in fact, implement, to get to the next level?
First of all, a word about Arise. I got into touch with this organization when I was Secretary School Education, and what a phenomenal organization with amazing people behind it. A lot of my work as Secretary School Education was facilitated by Arise. I mean, they went to the extent of even drafting a legislation. Imagine. So they are phenomenal people doing a great job. God bless them. As far as the larger education spectrum is concerned, I think a lot needs to be done. It was perhaps the only assignment in my entire career of 37 years as an IS officer where I felt that I should have had more time because of the sheer complexity of the issues. It's huge and complex. You look at the national education policy, it's easier to give ideas. And national education policy is a compendium of brilliant ideas, brilliantly presented, very well done. But the point is, how do you make it happen? As I often say, it's very easy to have ideas in this country. But for any idea to fructify and sustain over a period of time, it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable, emotionally relatable, and environmentally sustainable. In the context of education and education policies, I would look at two parts of it. One is the financial viability of it, and the other is administrative doability. Let me explain this to you. The education policy says that it would require 6% of GDP to implement the recommendation. Now, where is the money? When Dr. Kasturi Rangan came to meet me for my suggestions, I could visualize what he's going to do. I said, you'll come up with a lovely policy. But until you have an action plan along with the policy, clearly outlining what needs to be done, how it will be done, who will do it, by when it will be done, it will be a futile exercise, because it will be a document kept, it won't be implemented. And I see that problem with education policy. I don't see 6% GDP being allocated. If I were Dr. Kasturi Rangan, I would work out an action plan and say, this is priority number one. So if you have 2%, do this. If you have 3%, you do this. You prioritize and do it. So there is a serious financial problem with the national education policy and education in general, because the requisite allocation that should be made to education is not being made. But money is not the only problem. I think a major problem is human resource. And to me, teacher lies at the pivot of school education, and that's where the new national education policy has done a wonderful job. They've put the focus back on the teacher, and the provisions relating to teachers do not require that much financial commitment. So that is what they can do. But there are other issues with regard to human resource management that needs to be looked at, because that's the key. If you can't handle or tackle the teacher properly, education will never improve in this country.
Mr. Swarup, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but whatever time I've spoken to you, it's illuminated me once again. It's enlightened our audiences as well. And you speak straight from the heart, and that's so wonderful about this conversation as well. I appreciate and I thank you so much for joining us and giving us these insights. And of course, those anecdotes are going to go a long way. Thank you so much, sir, for
Thank
spending
you.
time and speaking to us. Thank you so much.